Hold on to the rope.
There is an old saying among the Sherpa people that the mountain is a living goddess, and sometimes she demands a sacrifice before she grants passage. It was March 23, 1963. Picture the world as it was then. John F. Kennedy was in the White House. The United States was locked in a race to the moon against the Soviet Union. But while the world looked up at the stars, a small, rugged team of Americans was looking at something equally formidable: the summit of Mount Everest. Up until that point, the British and the Swiss had conquered the roof of the world, but no American had ever stood on top. The pressure was on. This wasn't just a climb. It was a matter of national pride. Among this elite team was a young man from Wyoming named Jake Breitenbach. He wasn't famous. He was a mountain guide, a clothing store owner, a man who loved the silence of the high peaks. He was strong, capable, and ready to make history. But Everest has a way of humbling even the strongest men, and it often does so in the most terrifying place on the mountain, the Khumbu Icefall. Imagine a frozen river moving in slow-motion towers of ice the size of skyscrapers, leaning precariously, ready to topple at the slightest vibration. This is where Jake found himself that afternoon. The air was thin, the sun was bright, and the mood was optimistic. They were forging a path for the rest of the team. But in the blink of an eye, that beautiful, frozen landscape transformed into a nightmare. A sound like a cannon shot shattered the silence, and millions of pounds of ice began to move. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Ben's Stories. If you appreciate history, true tales of survival, and the stories of the brave men and women who pushed the limits of human endurance, you are in the right place. Today, we aren't just talking about a tragedy. We are talking about the legacy of a man whose loss paved the way for American glory. It's a heavy story, but one that deserves to be remembered. So, please, pull up a chair, settle in, and let us journey back to 1963. To truly understand the gravity of what happened to Jake Breitenbach, we have to look at the sheer scale of the 1963 American Mount Everest Expedition. You have to remember, back in the early 60s, Everest wasn't a commercial tourist destination. There were no fixed ladders maintained by separate companies, no internet at base camp, and certainly no rescue helicopters on standby that could pluck you from high altitude. It was the great unknown. The expedition was led by Norman Dyrenforth, a filmmaker and mountaineer who understood that to get Americans to the top, he needed organization that rivaled a military campaign, and that is exactly what it was. They had over 900 porters carrying 27 tons of food and equipment. They had funding from the National Geographic Society and the blessings of President Kennedy. The goal was simple but terrifying: put an American on the summit by any means necessary. But amidst this massive operation, it was the individual climbers who mattered most. The team was a who's who of American mountaineering. You had Big Jim Whittaker, who stood 6'5", a gentle giant from Seattle. You had Willie Unsole and Tom Hornbein, men of incredible intellect and grit. And then, you had Jake Brett. Jake was distinct. At just 27 years old, he was one of the younger members of the team. He hailed from Jackson Hole, Wyoming, where he worked as a mountain guide in the Tetons. If you know anything about the Tetons, you know they breed a specific kind of climber: tough, self-reliant, and incredibly comfortable on steep rock and ice. Jake was a man of the mountains, through and through. He had a dry wit, a bit of a rebellious trick. Some might have even called him a beatnik in those days, but his skill was undeniable. He had left behind a young wife and a clothing business to be here. He wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing the experience, the pure joy of the ascent. By late March, the team had established base camp at 17,800 feet. If you have ever seen photos of base camp, it looks like a city of tents on a glacier, surrounded by an amphitheater of stone and snow. But directly above base camp looms the Khumbu Icefall. It is the gateway to the upper mountain, and to this day, it remains the most dangerous section of the South Col route. Imagine a waterfall, frozen instantly in time. But this ice isn't static. The Khumbu Glacier moves. It slides downhill at a rate of several feet per day. As it moves over the uneven bedrock beneath it, the ice cracks, buckles, and splits open. It forms deep crevasses that are bottomless pits of blue darkness. It pushes up massive blocks of ice called seracs. Some of these seracs are the size of cars. Others are the size of apartment buildings, and they are unstable. They can collapse without warning at night when the temperature drops, or in the heat of the day when the sun melts their bonds. For the 1963 team, the Icefall was the puzzle they had to solve every single day. They had to forge a route through this chaotic labyrinth so the Sherpas could carry supplies to the higher camps. It was hard, physical labor. It involved chopping steps into the ice, laying aluminum ladders across gaping crevasses, and fixing nylon ropes to steep walls of ice. On the morning of March 23rd, the weather was crisp and clear. It was a perfect day for climbing. Jake Breitenbach was teamed up with Dick Pownell, another Teton guide and a close friend, and Ang Pema, a strong and experienced Sherpa. Their job was to improve the route through the lower section of the Icefall. They were working on a section known as the Dump, a particularly jumbled area where the ice was fractured and chaotic. This work is monotonous, rhythmic, and exhausting. You are wearing heavy high-altitude boots, crampons strapped to your feet, breathing air that has half the oxygen of sea level. Clad in wool and down, sweating despite the freezing temperatures, they moved slowly. Pownall and Breitenbach were tied together by a rope, a lifeline that connects climbers in case one falls into a crevasse. Around 2 p.m., they were taking a break. They had been working hard, chopping ice and fixing lines. They were standing on a relatively flat section of ice, surrounded by towering walls of white. It was peaceful. The only sounds were their own heavy breathing and the occasional creak of the glacier settling, a sound climbers get used to, like the settling of an old house. Dick Pownall was in the lead, chipping away at an ice block to create a better foothold. Jake was behind him, managing the rope. They were joking, perhaps talking about the hot meal waiting for them back at base camp, or maybe just enjoying the sun hitting their faces. They felt strong, they felt safe. They were the best climbers in America, doing what they loved in the most beautiful place on earth. But the thing about the Icefall is that it doesn't care about your skill level. It doesn't care about your preparation. It operates on physics and gravity alone. Above them, unseen and unheard, a massive section of the Icefall, a serac tower that had likely stood there for months, had reached its breaking point. The bonds holding tons of ice against the pull of gravity were snapping, microscopic fracture by microscopic fracture, until the structural integrity was gone. In the climbing world, we talk about objective hazards, dangers you cannot control, only avoid: rockfall, avalanches, and serac collapses. You can be the best climber in the world, but if you are standing in the wrong spot when the mountain decides to move, there is nothing you can do. Jake Breitenbach was about to become a part of history, not for standing on the summit, but for the tragic, random cruelty of the mountain. The silence of that March afternoon was about to be shattered forever. The sound didn't register as a noise at first. It was a physical sensation, a concussion of air that hit them before the roar reached their ears. It was the sound of the earth splitting apart. In the high thin air of the Himalayas, sound travels with a terrifying crispness. But this was different. This was a deep, guttural groan from the belly of the glacier, followed instantly by the crack of 1,000 rifles firing at once. Dick Pownall, who had been chipping away at the ice just moments before, looked up. What he saw defied comprehension. The massive wall of ice above them, a structure as tall and solid as a cathedral, was disintegrating. It wasn't falling in slow motion like you see in the movies. It was instantaneous violence. Thousands of tons of white death were cascading down directly upon them. "Run!" Pownall screamed. Or perhaps he just thought it. In moments like these, the conscious mind shuts down, and animal instinct takes over, but there was nowhere to run. They were in a bowling alley of ice, and the pins were being reset by a giant's hand. Pownall dove to the side, scrambling desperately to get under a small overhang, any bit of cover that might shield him from the crushing weight. Ang Pema, the Sherpa, was knocked flat, and Jake was right there, tethered to Pownall by the nylon rope, but positioned just a few feet further into the danger zone. The world turned white. A cloud of ice dust, pulverized snow, and debris exploded outward, blotting out the sun. It was cold, choking, and blinding. Then came the impact. For Pownall, it felt like being hit by a freight train. He was buried instantly under blocks of ice and snow. The breath was driven from his lungs. He was pinned, unable to move, unable to see, trapped in a dark, freezing tomb. For a few agonizing seconds, there was absolute silence, the deafening silence that follows a catastrophe. But Pownall was a fighter. He realized he wasn't crushed to death. He was pinned. He began to thrash, pushing with every ounce of strength he possessed against the debris covering him. He clawed his way upward, gasping for air, spitting out snow. He broke the surface, blinking in the returning sunlight, his chest heaving. He looked around, dazed. The landscape had changed. The familiar features of the route they had been working on were gone, erased by a chaotic pile of shattered ice blocks. He spotted Ang Pema nearby. The Sherpa was battered, bleeding from lacerations on his face, and clearly in shock, but he was alive. He was sitting up, looking at the devastation with wide, unbelieving eyes. Pownall's eyes frantically scanned the debris field. "Jake!" he screamed. "Jake!" His voice echoed off the canyon walls of the Icefall, but there was no answer. Then, he saw the rope. The yellow nylon rope that connected him to his friend. It stretched out from his own waist, taut and vibrating, disappearing straight into the heart of the massive pile of ice rubble. Pownall scrambled over the jagged blocks, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He grabbed the rope and pulled. It was immovable. It was anchored fast, buried under tons of ice. He followed the line with his eyes. It led directly beneath a serac block the size of 2 railway cars that had come to rest in the center of the collapse. Panic, cold and sharp, set in. Pownall and Ang Pema began to dig. They dug with their ice axes. They dug with their gloved hands, tearing at the snow and ice until their fingers were numb and their muscles screamed. They shouted Jake's name over and over again, praying for a muffled reply, a groan, anything. But the mountain remained silent. As the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a creeping, horrific realization, the scale of the disaster became clear. This wasn't a small slide. The entire section of the Icefall had collapsed. The block resting on top of where Jake should have been was estimated to weigh hundreds of tons. There was no digging him out, not with axes, not with shovels, not with anything they had. Pownall stood there, gasping for air in the thin atmosphere, staring at the rope disappearing into the white grave. He pulled on it one last time, a futile gesture of connection to the man on the other end. The rope didn't give an inch. Jake Breitenbach, the witty, strong, 27-year-old from Wyoming, was gone. Buried instantly, likely killed on impact. Entombed in the ice he loved so much. The news had to be sent down. Back at base camp, the radio crackled to life. The team had been going about their daily routines, sorting gear, writing letters home, preparing for the next rotation. The voice on the radio was strained, breathless, and carried a tone that stopped everyone in their tracks. "Accident in the icefall," the voice said. "Jake is dead." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Jim Whittaker, who would later go on to become the first American to summit, recalled the moment as a punch to the gut. Norman Dyrenforth, the expedition leader, felt the weight of the world crash down on his shoulders. They had expected hardship. They had expected frostbite, altitude sickness, perhaps even broken bones, but death. On the very first major push, it was a nightmare scenario. A rescue party was scrambled immediately, though rescue was a hopeful word for what was now a recovery mission. The strongest climbers in camp grabbed their gear and raced up the glacier, their lungs burning, their minds racing. When they arrived at the site, the reality of the situation crushed any lingering hope. They saw Pownall, battered and shaken, standing guard over the debris. They saw the blood on Angpima's face, and they saw the massive, immovable tomb of ice. The team members, men who had climbed all over the world, men who were stoic and tough, stared in disbelief. Dr. Willie Unsold, one of the spiritual leaders of the group, looked at the scene with tears in his eyes. Tom Hornbein, a doctor and climber of immense skill, shook his head. There was nothing to be done. The physics of the situation were absolute. To try and remove the ice block would require heavy machinery they didn't have, or explosives that would likely trigger another collapse and kill them all. They realized then that they wouldn't be bringing Jake home. They wouldn't be sending a casket back to Wyoming. This place, this chaotic, frozen, beautiful, and deadly river of ice, would be his final resting place. The sun began to dip behind the ridges, casting long blue shadows across the icefall. The temperature plummeted. The mountain, indifferent to their grief, began to creak and groan again as the ice cooled. The climbers stood in a semicircle around the site, small, colorful figures against the vastness of the white. They were faced with a choice, one that every high-altitude expedition hopes to never make. They could retreat, demoralized and broken, and go home. Or, they could accept the sacrifice, bury their grief, and keep climbing. But in that moment, standing in the wreckage of the icefall, nobody was thinking about the summit. They were thinking about Jake. They were thinking about his wife back home. They were thinking about how fragile the line is between life and death in the high mountains. Just inches, just seconds. If Pownall had been in the lead, or if they had taken a break 5 minutes earlier, things might have been different. The shock was absolute. The American dream of Everest had run headfirst into the brutal reality of the Himalayas. And as they turned to make the somber trek back down to base camp, leaving their friend beneath the ice, the silence of the mountain felt heavier than ever before. That night at base camp was the longest any of them had ever endured. The temperature outside dropped to 20 below zero, but inside the tents, the chill was entirely internal. You have to understand the psychology of an expedition like this. A team is a living organism. It breathes together, eats together, struggles together. When a limb is severed suddenly and violently, the shock sends the whole body into a state of paralysis. Jake's sleeping bag lay empty. His personal effects, a book he was reading, a letter he was writing, his extra pair of socks were exactly where he had left them. In the communal mess tent, men who were usually loud, cracking jokes and debating politics, sat in stunned silence. They stared into their tin mugs of tea, afraid to look each other in the eye. Norman Dyrenforth, the expedition leader, faced a crushing burden. He wasn't just responsible for the climb. He was responsible for these men's lives. He sat by the radio, composing the message that no one ever wants to send. He had to tell the world. But more importantly, and more heartbreakingly, he had to tell Jake's young wife back in Wyoming that she was now a widow. There were no satellite phones in 1963. The message had to be carried by a runner from base camp down to the nearest village with a telegraph office. A journey of days. The news would travel slowly, a creeping shadow making its way across the ocean to America. But while the message made its way down the valley, a heavy question hung over base camp. What now? The next morning, Dyrenforth called a meeting in the big mess tent. The mood was grim. The expedition had barely begun. They hadn't even reached the difficult climbing on the upper mountain yet, and they had already paid the ultimate price. The superstitious nature of the Sherpas was also a factor. To them, the mountain had spoken. The goddess Myeolong-sangma had taken a life. Was it a warning to stop? Or was the toll paid? Dyrenforth looked at his team: Jim Whittaker, Luke Gersted, Tom Hornbein, Willie Unsold, and the others. He laid it out plainly. They had the funding, they had the gear, and they had the eyes of the president and the country on them. but they also had a dead friend buried just a few thousand feet above their heads. "We can pack up," Dyrenforth said, his voice heavy with fatigue. "We can go home. No one would blame us. The icefall is unstable. It's a Russian roulette up there." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind flapping the canvas of the tent. Then, the voices began to rise. It wasn't a debate about glory or fame, it was a debate about meaning. If they packed up and left now, Jake Breitenbach's death becomes a senseless accident, a waste. He died for nothing but a failed trip. But if they continued, if they pushed on and planted the stars and stripes on the summit, then, perhaps, his death becomes part of something larger. It becomes a sacrifice for a historic achievement. Tom Hornbein, the small, fierce anesthesiologist who would go on to become a legend, spoke up. He knew Jake well. He knew that Jake was a climber's climber. He wasn't the type to turn back. Jake came here to climb. The sentiment went around the room. He wouldn't want us to quit because of him. It sounds like a cliché in movies, doesn't it? He would have wanted us to go on. But in high-altitude mountaineering, this is a profound truth. Climbers accept the risk. They sign the contract with mortality the moment they step onto the glacier. The decision was made. They would continue. But the tone of the expedition had changed forever. The youthful innocence, the Boy Scout adventure vibe, was gone. It was replaced by a grim, steely determination. They weren't just climbing for America anymore. They were climbing for Jake. However, deciding to continue and actually doing it are two very different things. To continue meant one terrifying thing. They had to go back into the icefall. They had to walk right past the site of the accident. 2 days later, the climbing resumed. Imagine the mental fortitude required for that. You strap your crampons on, you rope up, you walk into the same frozen maze that just killed your friend. As the climbers approached the dump, the area where the collapse happened, the scene was sobering. The landscape was unrecognizable. The massive blocks of ice had settled. Somewhere beneath thousands of tons of white debris lay Jake. There was no grave marker. There was no way to retrieve him. The glacier was his tomb. As they passed the spot, each climber had a moment of silence. They moved quickly, not out of disrespect, but out of necessity. The seracs were still leaning. The ice was still moving. They had to navigate the very hazard that took Jake, knowing it could happen again at any second. This psychological hurdle is often harder than the physical climbing. Every creak of the ice, every shift of the snow, sent a jolt of adrenaline through their veins. They re-established the route, often weaving around the debris field. The Sherpas, despite their fears, shouldered their loads and carried on, chanting low prayers as they passed the site. A few weeks later, closer to the lot's face, the team held a formal memorial service. It was a clear, cold day. They built a cairn, a stack of rock sand, a prominent ridge near base camp where it would be swept away by avalanches. Dr. Willie Unsold, a man of deep faith and philosophy, led the service. He spoke to the men huddled in their down podcasts. He talked about the mystery of death and the majesty of the mountains. He spoke of Jake's spirit. It wasn't a long ceremony. At 17,800 feet, you don't stand around without gloves for long. But it was the closure they needed. They carved Jake's name into a rock. They said their goodbyes. And then, they turned their backs on the memorial and looked up. Above them, the summit of Everest tore into the jet stream, a plume of snow trailing from the peak like a white flag. But this team wasn't surrendering. The tragedy had done something unexpected to the team dynamics. It fractured them, yes, but it also hardened them. Specifically, it fueled a fire in Tom Hornbein and Willie Unsold. They had this crazy idea, a plan that was even more dangerous than the standard route. They didn't just want to climb Everest. They wanted to climb it via the West Ridge. The West Ridge had never been climbed. It was steeper, harder, and more committed than the South Col route. Most of the team, and certainly the leadership, thought it was suicide, especially after losing Jake. Why risk more lives on an unproven route when the standard route was right there? But Hornbein was possessed by a vision. He felt that simply trudging up the standard route wasn't enough of a tribute to the spirit of mountaineering. He wanted to do something bold. The ghost of Jake Breitenbach seemed to whisper that safety was an illusion anyway. You could die on the easy route just as easily as the hard one. So why not try for the impossible? The expedition effectively split into two minds. The South Col team, led by Big Jim Whitaker, aiming for a sure success to satisfy the sponsors and the president. And the West Ridge Renegades, aiming for pure alpinism. The shadow of Jake's death lay over both groups. For Whitaker, it was the pressure to ensure Jake didn't die in vain by getting someone to the top. For Hornbein, it was a reminder that life is short, so you might as well aim for the biggest, hardest target you can find. As April turned to May, the mountain began to fight back in earnest. High winds battered the camps. Tents were shredded. Oxygen bottles ran low. The logistics of moving tons of supplies past the spot where Jake died became a daily grind. But every time they walked through the icefall, they paid their tithe of fear and respect. They were getting closer to the death zone, that altitude above 26,000 feet where the human body begins to die. And as they poised themselves for the final assault, they carried the memory of the young man from Wyoming with them. He was the silent partner on every rope team. But Everest wasn't done with them yet. the summit bid would bring its own set of miracles and near disasters, testing the very limits of what humans could endure. And it would all come down to a flag, a ridge, and a night spent in the open that no one should have survived. On May 1, 1963, the ghost of the expedition was finally laid to rest, or perhaps, finally honored. Big Jim Whittaker and Sherpa Nawang Gambu were battling wind gusts of 60 miles per hour. They were on the southeast ridge, gasping for air, their oxygen masks freezing to their faces. Every step was a battle of will against biology, but at 1 p.m., the slope leveled off. There was nowhere left to climb. They stood on the summit of the world. Whittaker planted the American flag. It snapped violently in the gale, a burst of color against the deep, dark indigo of the stratospheric sky. In that moment, the mission was accomplished. The United States had joined the exclusive club of nations to conquer Everest. Jake Breitenbach's death had not been in vain. The team had done what they said they would do. But if this were a Hollywood movie, the credits would roll right there. But real history is messier, and often, much more incredible. Because while Whittaker's success secured the national pride, the true climax of human endurance, the part of the story that defies all medical logic, was just beginning. 3 weeks later, on May 22nd, 2 simultaneous assaults were launched. Luke Gersted and Barry Bishop were heading up the standard South Col route, following Whittaker's footsteps. But on the other side of the mountain, Tom Hornbein and Willie Unsold were attempting the impossible. They were in the Hornbein Couloir, a steep, narrow gully of rotten rock and bulletproof ice on the west ridge. They were climbing terrain that had never been touched by human hands. It was technical, exhausting, and terrifying. They reached a point of no return. The climbing was so difficult that downclimbing was impossible. They had to go up, or they would die trying. Late in the afternoon, long after the safe turnaround time, Hornbein and Unsold pulled themselves over the final limestone band. They walked the final few steps and stood on the summit. It was 6:15 p.m. The sun was setting. They had done it. They had pioneered a new route up Everest. But their triumph was immediately overshadowed by a terrifying reality. They had to get down. And they couldn't go back the way they came. They had to descend the South Col route, a route they didn't know, in the dark. This set the stage for one of the most famous encounters in mountaineering history. As Hornbein and Unsold descended the southeast ridge, using their flashlights to pierce the blackness, they heard voices. Below them, Luke Gersted and Barry Bishop were struggling. They were exhausted, out of oxygen, and stumbling in the dark after their own summit push earlier that day. At 28,000 feet, in the pitch-black death zone, the two teams met. It was a reunion of ghosts. They were all depleted. Their oxygen tanks were empty. They were dehydrated. And they were still high in the death zone. They realized with a sinking horror that they couldn't make it down to Camp 6. The terrain was too treacherous to navigate by torchlight in their condition. If they kept moving, someone would fall. If they stopped, they would freeze. They chose to stop. What happened next is known in mountaineering lore as the highest bivouac. For men Hornbein, Unsold, Bishop, and Gersted huddled together on a small outcrop of rock at 28,000 feet. They had no tents. They had no sleeping bags. They had no stove to melt snow for water. They had no oxygen. At that altitude, the ambient air temperature plunges to -20, -30 degrees. But the real killer is the wind. The jet stream usually rakes the ridge at over 100 miles per hour. If the wind blew, they would be dead in minutes. They would be frozen statues by morning, joining Jake Breitenbach as permanent residents of the mountain. The men huddled together in a pile, trying to share body warmth. They hallucinated. They drifted in and out of consciousness, checking each other to make sure they were still breathing. They waited for the wind to tear them off the mountain. But then, a miracle happened. The wind died. For the first time in weeks, the air on the upper ridges of Everest became perfectly still. The silence was absolute. Above them, the stars didn't twinkle. They burned with a steady, unblinking light because there was so little atmosphere to distort them. It was a cosmic silence. Dr. Willie Unsold, the philosopher of the group, later said it felt like the mountain was holding its breath. It was as if the goddess Myo-Longsangma, having taken her sacrifice in the icefall 2 months earlier, had decided to show mercy. She had taken Jake, but she would spare these 4. They shivered uncontrollably, their bodies burning the last of their caloric reserves to keep their cores warm. Frostbite began to gnaw at their toes and fingers. Barry Bishop and Luke Gersted were in bad shape. Unsold and Hornbein, buoyed by the adrenaline of their West Ridge success, were slightly stronger, but fading fast. The night stretched on for what felt like a century. Every minute was a battle to stay awake, to keep the blood moving. They thought of home. They thought of the warmth of a fire. And surely, in the back of their hypoxic minds, they thought of Jake. They were dancing on the same razor's edge that he had fallen from. When the sun finally rose on the morning of May 23rd, it didn't bring warmth, but it brought light. The 4 men, looking like frozen scarecrows, stiffly stood up. They were alive. They began the agonizing descent. It would take days to get down. They would lose toes and fingers to frostbite. They would be carried out on the backs of Sherpas, but they had survived the highest open bivouac in history. They had completed the first traverse of Mount Everest, going up one side and coming down the other. It was a feat of exploration that rivaled the moon landing in terms of audacity and risk. As they stumbled down toward the safety of the lower camps, the news was already flashing around the world. The Americans had not only climbed Everest, they had conquered it in style. They had done the impossible. But as the celebrations began in Washington, D.C. and Seattle, the team had to pass through the ice fall one last time. They had to walk past the tomb of their friend. The glory of the West Ridge and the miracle of the bivouac were dazzling, but the cost was buried in the ice. The expedition was a triumph, yes, but as they packed up base camp, leaving the empty space where Jake's tent used to be, the feeling wasn't just joy. It was a profound, complicated mix of relief, pride, and sorrow. They were going home as heroes. Jake was staying. On July 8, 1963, the survivors of the expedition stood in the Rose Garden of the White House. The sun was shining, cameras were flashing, and President John F. Kennedy was smiling. He handed them the Hubbard Medal, the National Geographic Society's highest honor. It was a moment of supreme national triumph. The Americans had finally done it. But in the photos of that day, if you look closely, there is a heaviness in the eyes of the climbers. And there was one medal that wasn't pinned to the chest of a man in a suit. It was handed, gently, to a young woman named Louise. She was Jake Breitenbach's widow. She stood there accepting the glory on behalf of the man who never came home. The man whose body was still encased in the freezing darkness of the Khumbu Icefall. For years, that was where the story ended. A triumph for the nation, a tragedy for a family in Wyoming. But the mountain is a living thing, and it has a long memory. Remember how we talked about the glacier moving? That river of ice flows downhill, day by day, year by year. It never stops. In 1969, 6 years after the tragedy, another American expedition returned to Everest. As they were hiking near the bottom of the icefall, where the glacier melts into a stream of rocky debris, they found something. The mountain, in its own slow, geological time, had carried Jake Breitenbach down. The ice had finally given him up. It was a stark reminder of the pact climbers make with nature. We borrow time from the mountains, but the mountains always collect their due. Jake Breitenbach didn't stand on the summit. He didn't get the ticker tape parade. But make no mistake, the American success in 1963 was built on his shoulders. His loss forged the steel in the spines of the men who continued. It was his memory that pushed Hornbein and Unsold through that impossible night at 28,000 feet. He was the silent member of the team, the tithe paid to the icefall so that others could touch the sky. His story reminds us that history is unjust made by the people holding the flag in the final photo. It is often made by the ones who pave the way and pay the price before the flashbulbs go off. And that brings us to the end of this journey. I want to ask you a question, and I'd love for you to answer it in the comments below. Do you believe the glory of conquering a mountain like Everest is worth the human cost? It's a question that has haunted mountaineering for a century, and I want to hear your perspective. If this story moved you, if you felt the chill of the icefall and the triumph of the summit, please do me a favor. Click that subscribe button and hit the bell icon right now. Here at Ben's Stories, we are dedicated to keeping these histories alive. We dig deep into the archives to bring you the true, unvarnished tales of courage and survival that you won't find anywhere else. By subscribing, you ensure that men like Jake Breitenbach are never forgotten. Thank you for watching, thank you for respecting the history, and as always I'll see you in the next story. Stay safe out there.